What if the most controlling system in Pride and Prejudice was never society, but something much closer to home? Not the ballroom. Not the letters. Not even the rules of courtship. But the house itself. Longbourn. A space that looks ordinary at first glance. Brick walls, doors, windows, yet behaves like a silent intelligence system. A structure that doesn't speak, but constantly shapes what can be thought, what can be feared, and ultimately, what can be chosen. And here is the unsettling question: if every room in a house carries a different emotional pressure, are we still living freely, or are we simply responding to architecture we don't understand? This is where the contradiction begins. Because Austen's world is often read as manners, irony, romance. But underneath that surface layer, there is something colder, more structural. Longbourn doesn't just contain the Bennet family, it organizes their anxiety. A memory fragment appears early if you look closely. The house is never described as neutral space. It is always felt through tension, waiting, uncertainty, expectation. Rooms are not empty. They are loaded with social survival pressure. A dining room is never just a dining room. A hallway is never just a passage. Each space carries an invisible function in the psychology of the household. And so the first insight emerges: Longbourn operates less like a home, and more like a distributed system of emotional control. Now shift scale for a moment. Because this is not just about one family. In Austen's world, the domestic sphere is the entire stage of survival. Marriage is not romance, it is infrastructure. Reputation is not identity, it is currency. And the house becomes the interface where all of it is processed. Here's the revelation beginning to surface: if you change the room, you change the emotion. If you change the emotion, you change the decision. And if you change the decision, you change the future. So what looks like architecture is actually behavioral design. But the contradiction deepens. Because no one in Longbourn ever explicitly controls anyone. There is no visible authority issuing commands. No system announcing itself. And yet every character behaves as if pressure is always present, subtle, constant, unavoidable. That is the consequence layer most readers miss. Control does not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as environment, as atmosphere, as spatial expectation. A memory fragment that captures this idea: silence in shared rooms is never neutral, it becomes judgment. Movement in corridors is never neutral, it becomes observation. Even waiting becomes participation in a system that never announces its rules. And here is the escalation that changes everything. If Longbourn can shape behavior without speaking, then the real question is not what the characters want, but what the space allows them to want. Now the system reveals its deeper architecture. Each room is not just a location. It is a psychological threshold. A place where anxiety is sorted into action. Where uncertainty is converted into social behavior. Where fear becomes strategy without anyone realizing the transformation has happened. And this leads to a greater contradiction: freedom inside Longbourn is not removed. It is redistributed into smaller and smaller decisions until it no longer feels like freedom at all. So we arrive at a final question, one that destabilizes the entire reading of Austen's domestic world. If a house can silently organize fear, shape perception, and guide life choices, then what exactly are we calling private life? Because Longbourn may not be an exception in Austen's universe. It may be the prototype. And once you see it this way, you start to wonder whether every familiar space, every home, every room, every quiet corner of daily life, is simply another version of the same invisible system, still waiting to be decoded. But here is the deeper tension you don't notice at first. If a house can organize fear, then where exactly does that fear originate? Inside the people, or inside the system that quietly trains them? Because once you accept that Longbourn behaves like a psychological structure, the conflict is no longer about individual personalities. It becomes about pressure distribution. About how uncertainty is divided across rooms until it feels natural. And this is where the system reveals a second layer of control. A memory fragment surfaces here, no character in the house ever describes their environment as controlling. Yet every decision, every hesitation, every expectation, seems to align with invisible boundaries they never agreed to. That contradiction is not accidental. It is structural. So the question becomes sharper: how can influence be so strong without ever appearing as force? To understand this, you have to widen the frame. Because Longbourn is not just a residence, it is a negotiation space between survival and identity. Every room carries a different type of pressure: financial anxiety, social visibility, marital urgency, emotional restraint. None of them are stated directly, but all of them are felt continuously. And here's the first escalation: the house does not tell people what to do. It limits what feels reasonable to do. That shift changes everything. Insight emerges. Control is most effective when it becomes indistinguishable from atmosphere. Now consider the contradiction inside the Bennett household dynamic. Each person appears to operate independently: different temperaments, different desires, different emotional rhythms. Yet their behaviors converge around the same invisible constraint: the urgency of securing social stability through marriage. Why does this convergence happen without coordination? A revelation begins forming. The structure of the house acts like a silent coordinator, aligning fear into shared direction without explicit communication. Scale shifts again. Because what appears domestic is actually systemic. Longbourn reflects a broader social architecture where family units are not private shelters, but microeconomic survival nodes. The house is where external pressures are compressed into internal behavior. Memory fragment: corridors become waiting zones, not physically, but psychologically. People pause, adjust, listen, anticipate. Not because they are told to, but because the environment rewards anticipation over spontaneity. This leads to a deeper consequence. When space teaches anticipation, people begin to mistake caution for wisdom. And that is where the system becomes self-sustaining. Because once behavior adapts to space, space no longer needs to enforce anything directly. It simply exists, and the people inside continue adjusting themselves indefinitely. But here is the contradiction that destabilizes everything: no one in Longbourn is trapped by walls. They are trapped by expectations that the space continuously reinforces. So the real mechanism is not physical containment. It is behavioral conditioning through repetition of environment. And this brings us closer to the hidden center of the system. If each room represents a different emotional function, then the house is not a place at all. It is an operating model for human anxiety. Now the mystery deepens further. Because if Longbourn can silently organize fear into predictable behavior, then what happens when someone stops responding predictably? What happens when an individual begins to interpret the space differently than the system intends? Does the structure adapt, or does it begin to fail? And that question opens something larger than the house itself. If environments shape perception this deeply, how many of our own, ordinary spaces, are quietly directing decisions we believe are entirely ours? The deeper you move through this system, the more unsettling the realization becomes. If behavior is shaped by space, then resistance cannot begin with action, it must begin with perception. But here is the question that fractures everything established so far: what happens when perception itself is already being shaped before awareness even forms? Because at this stage, Longbourn is no longer just influencing decisions. It is influencing interpretation. The way meaning is assigned to silence, to distance, to presence itself. And that is a fundamentally different level of control. A memory fragment becomes important here. Within the household, no instruction is ever explicitly given about how to feel in a room. Yet emotional responses consistently align with the function of each space. Anticipation in transitional spaces. Constraint in shared spaces. Evaluation in socially exposed spaces. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. So the context expands. This is not behavioral pressure alone. This is semantic conditioning. The environment is training interpretation, not just action. And that is where the first real contradiction emerges. Because the characters still believe they are making independent emotional judgments. They believe hesitation is personal, that anxiety is internal, that urgency is situational. Yet every one of these states maps cleanly onto spatial logic that predates their awareness. So the question becomes sharper: if emotion aligns with architecture without awareness, where does individuality actually begin? Escalation follows immediately. Longbourn begins to resemble less a home and more a distributed cognitive system. Not one that dictates choices, but one that biases interpretation pathways. It does not say, choose this. It makes certain interpretations feel more natural than others. And that is the hidden mechanism, naturalness as control. A revelation begins to surface, but not fully formed yet. What feels personal may actually be patterned. What feels spontaneous may actually be guided by repeated environmental association. Now scale shifts outward. Because this is no longer just about one household, or even one social class. It reflects a broader structure where private space becomes a medium of psychological calibration. The domestic environment is not separate from society. It is where society becomes internalized. Memory fragment, moments of hesitation are not isolated events. They repeat in different rooms, under different conditions, but with the same emotional architecture. As if the house is rehearsing the same psychological pattern through multiple scenarios. And this repetition creates a deeper consequence. When patterns repeat without visibility, people begin to attribute structure to themselves instead of the environment. That is the turning point of the system. Self-blame replaces structural awareness. Now the contradiction reaches its most unstable form. The more invisible the influence becomes, the more it is perceived as personal truth. The house does not need to enforce behavior because individuals begin to enforce it internally. So Longbourn is no longer acting outwardly. It has become internalized architecture. And here is where escalation breaks into crisis. If the system can move from space into perception, then escape cannot be physical. It must be cognitive. But that leads directly into an unresolved tension. Because if perception itself is structured, then even the awareness of structure may already be shaped by it. And this leads to a deeper mystery opening, one that cannot yet be closed. If every interpretation is filtered through an environment that predates awareness, then how can anyone ever recognize the system they are already inside? The moment you begin to suspect that perception itself is structured, a more unsettling possibility emerges. What if the system is not only shaping interpretation, but also shaping the very moments in which interpretation becomes possible? And that leads to a question that reframes everything. If awareness always arrives inside a pre-shaped environment, what would it even mean to see the system clearly? At this point, something shifts. Not through action, but through recognition. A revelation begins to surface, not as a new fact, but as a reordering of everything that came before it. The structure of Longbourn is not primarily psychological, and not even social in the way it first appeared. It is architectural in a far more precise sense. It encodes expectation into physical space so consistently that emotional response becomes predictable before conscious thought can interfere. This is where the memory fragment becomes decisive. Rooms are not neutral containers waiting for meaning to be assigned. They are preloaded contexts. A shared dining space does not merely host interaction, it compresses hierarchy. A corridor does not merely connect locations, it enforces transition anxiety. Even stillness in a bedroom is not absence of activity, it is a structured pause that amplifies internal dialogue. And here is the revelation inside that pattern. Longbourn does not control behavior by restricting choice, but by designing the conditions under which certain choices feel inevitable. That is the hidden architecture. Now the insight deepens. If inevitability can be designed through environment, then freedom is not eliminated, it is narrowed into predictable channels. Individuals still believe they are deciding, but the range of felt possibilities has already been filtered by space itself before decision ever occurs. This creates a far more complex consequence than earlier stages suggested. The characters are not simply responding to pressure. They are operating inside a system that continuously preselects emotional interpretations, which then generate behaviors that reinforce the system's apparent naturalness. It becomes self-validating. The structure appears true because it consistently produces behavior that confirms its own logic. And now the scale shifts again. Because this is no longer just about one household or one literary setting. It reflects a broader mechanism embedded in how environments shape identity formation itself. Social structures do not only exist externally, they reproduce themselves through spatial repetition, where daily movement becomes unconscious reinforcement of hierarchy, expectation, and constraint. A memory fragment emerges here. The most ordinary moments carry the most structural weight. Sitting, waiting, crossing a threshold. These are not dramatic events, but they are precisely where interpretation is quietly trained. And that is where the contradiction resolves into something sharper. What appeared earlier as invisible influence is not absence of structure, it is structure that has achieved total normalization. When a system no longer needs to announce itself, it has succeeded in becoming indistinguishable from reality. But this creates a new tension. If inevitability is designed through environment, then recognition itself becomes unstable. Because the moment someone perceives structure, they are still perceiving it from within the same conditions that produce the perception. And this leads to a deeper revelation that has not fully formed yet. The system may not require concealment at all. It may function precisely because it is visible, familiar, and therefore never questioned. So the greater question emerges, heavier than before. If the architecture of everyday space is already shaping what feels inevitable, then what part of human choice is ever truly outside the design of the world it inhabits? Then the final structure reveals itself not as a hidden force, but as something far more unsettling, a system that does not need to hide, because it survives through normalization. And that leads to the deep question at the center of everything: if an environment successfully becomes indistinguishable from reality itself, what remains that could ever stand outside of it? The core revelation is this: Longbourn is not simply shaping behavior or even shaping perception. It is shaping the horizon of what can be imagined as normal life. Every room, every transition, every social interaction is not an isolated psychological trigger, but a coordinated architecture of plausibility. It does not force decisions. It defines the boundaries of what decisions feel realistic in the first place. At this level, the house stops being a setting and becomes a framework of possibility. A silent logic embedded into space. A system that does not say what to do, but quietly eliminates what feels impossible to do until only a narrow corridor of action remains. That is why the characters never feel controlled, even while their lives consistently converge toward predictable outcomes. The control has already been absorbed into the definition of what feels like a reasonable life. A memory fragment anchors this realization: the most powerful constraint is not the locked door, but the room that feels completely open while still guiding every movement inside it. Space does not resist freedom. It defines it until resistance no longer appears necessary. From here, the insight expands outward. The family structure is no longer the core unit of analysis. It is a transmission node. Longbourn functions as a translation layer between economic pressure, social expectation, and personal identity. Marriage is not an emotional endpoint but a structural resolution to spatial pressure. Even desire becomes something organized by environment rather than generated in isolation. And this is where the consequence becomes unavoidable. If what feels like personal intention is continuously filtered through environmental design, then individuality is no longer the starting point of action. It becomes the output of a system that has already shaped the emotional conditions under which intention forms. Choice still exists, but only within a pre-shaped emotional map that feels self-evident because it is constantly reinforced by lived space. Now the scale shifts again, and the implications extend beyond the novel entirely. This is not only about a household in a historical context. It reflects the structural principle of human environments. That repetition of space creates repetition of thought, and repetition of thought eventually disguises itself as personality. What begins as architecture becomes identity through accumulation. A memory fragment surfaces here with quiet force. The most influential systems are not those that demand attention, but those that become invisible through familiarity. The less noticeable the structure, the the more completely it defines behavior over time. And at the deepest philosophical layer, the contradiction dissolves into clarity. The system does not need to prevent awareness of itself. It only needs to ensure that awareness never produces alternative reality. Recognition without escape is not failure of perception. It is completion of design. So the final question emerges, heavier than all before it, no longer about a house, nor a family, nor even a society, but about the nature of human experience itself. If every sense of what is normal, possible, and reasonable is continuously formed inside environments that predefine those categories, then what would it actually mean for a human mind to think outside the architecture that first taught it how to think at all? What remains after a system has successfully shaped what feels normal is not resistance, and not even awareness, but something far more subtle, adaptation so complete that it becomes indistinguishable from identity itself. And the consequence at this stage is no longer theoretical. It is lived. When environment defines the boundaries of what feels reasonable, human decisions do not disappear, they simply become synchronized with the structure that produces them. Choice continues, but only inside a corridor that feels emotionally natural, as if it were self-authored. A memory fragment reappears with new weight in this context. The most powerful influence is not the one that commands action, but the one that shapes the emotional cost of imagining alternatives. In Longbourn, every deviation carries an invisible friction, not because it is forbidden, but because it feels misaligned with the atmosphere itself. From this, expansion becomes unavoidable. What begins as a household dynamic expands into a broader mechanism of continuity. The system does not only influence the present moment. It ensures repetition across time. Patterns of expectation are inherited through space, reinforced through daily movement, and stabilized through repetition until they appear as personality traits rather than environmental echoes. This is where legacy takes form. Longbourn does not simply affect the individuals within it. It leaves behind a model of human experience where structure and self become indistinguishable. The legacy is not emotional. It is architectural. It demonstrates how identity can be quietly assembled through repeated exposure to spatial logic until the origin of that identity is no longer traceable. A second memory fragment emerges here. When people leave a structured environment, they often carry its logic with them, reconstructing familiar emotional patterns even in unfamiliar spaces. The system extends beyond walls because it has already been internalized as expectation. And now the scale shifts beyond the narrative entirely. What Longbourn represents is not unique to its setting. It becomes a reflection of how human systems persist, through normalization, through repetition, through environments that teach individuals what kind of emotional responses belong to what kind of spaces. The home becomes a prototype for larger structures, social systems, cultural expectations, even modern environments where design quietly influences attention, behavior, and interpretation. At this level, the distinction between external structure and internal identity begins to dissolve. What once appeared as a setting becomes a cognitive inheritance. People do not simply live within systems. They carry them forward, unconsciously reconstructing their logic in new contexts. And here is the reflection that emerges from this legacy. If identity is partially assembled through repeated spatial and emotional conditions, then what we consider personal development may often be the slow absorption of environments we no longer recognize as influential. A final memory fragment anchors the entire progression. The most enduring systems are not those that remain visible, but those that continue operating after they are no longer perceived as systems at all. And so the consequence extends into a final, unresolved space. If environments can be internalized to the point where their logic feels identical to personal intention, then even the act of questioning that logic may already be shaped by it. Which leads to a deeper uncertainty that cannot be resolved within the boundaries of observation alone. What parts of human identity are truly authored by the self, and what parts are simply the continuation of spaces that no longer need to exist in order to still be obeyed. In the end, what remains is not the structure itself, but the recognition that structure was never separate from experience in the first place. And the final insight arrives quietly, almost without resistance, What shapes human life most profoundly is not the events that stand out, but the environments that never announce their influence while continuously defining what feels like reality. This is where everything converges. Longbourn, once perceived as a setting, becomes something closer to a persistent grammar of existence. Not a voice, not a rule, but a system that organizes meaning before meaning is ever consciously formed. Its legacy is not visible in any single decision, but in the continuity of how decisions begin to feel reasonable in the first place. A memory fragment returns as the final echo of this idea. The most ordinary spaces are often the ones that disappear from perception precisely because they are doing the most work. Rooms are forgotten not because they are empty, but because they are too familiar to question. And in that familiarity, they quietly shape what is remembered as choice. The human meaning of this realization extends beyond any one family, any one narrative, any one historical moment. It points toward a broader condition of experience itself. People do not simply live inside environments. They translate environments into identity over time. What begins as external structure becomes internal rhythm, until the boundary between influence and self becomes impossible to draw with certainty. And so the legacy of this kind of system is not control in the traditional sense. It is continuity. It is the silent passing of invisible frameworks from space into thought, from thought into habit, and from habit into the feeling of selfhood. Nothing needs to be enforced when everything has already been normalized. Another memory fragment lingers here. When a structure becomes fully absorbed, it no longer needs to be seen to remain active. It continues through repetition, through expectation, through the unnoticed weight of what feels familiar. At this point, the reflection no longer belongs only to literature. It becomes a mirror placed in front of everyday life. Every environment carries this possibility. Every space holds the capacity to shape perception not through instruction, but through repetition that feels like comfort. And this is where the final philosophical tension settles in. If what feels natural is continuously shaped by what surrounds us, and what surrounds us continuously shapes what we become, then the idea of a fully independent self becomes less like a starting point and more like an ongoing negotiation with the spaces we move through. So the question that remains is not whether environments influence us, but something far more unsettling and far more personal. If the boundaries of what feels like reality are formed quietly by the spaces we no longer notice, then who are we becoming in the parts of our life we have stopped paying attention to?